Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks for folks who are online. We're here today to discuss my colleague, Dr. Pavan Mano's new book, Straight Nation, Heteronormativity, and Other Exigencies of Post-Colonial Nationalism. It's a mouthful, but one for a really excellent book. Pav teaches here at King's College, London, in the Department of Interdisciplinary Humanities, and has been doing that for the past 2 years. He also has a PhD from King's as well, and did a postdoc at UCL.
Indeed.
Indeed he did. So I'm very excited that we have some time to discuss this really excellent book. I also wanted to say thanks to the folks at ASEN, the Association for the Study of Ethnicity and Nationalism, and David in particular for organizing this event and this opportunity to talk about Pav's book. So the format for the next hour and a half or so is that we'll kind of chat about the book, probably for 50 minutes or an hour. We'll kind of see where the conversation takes us. I'll give some kind of preliminary thoughts and kind of a broad introduction to some of the main thematics, and we can kind of chat through some of the intricacies of the book and some kind of questions that emerge from it, and then we'll open up in the last 20 or 30 minutes to questions that people have both in person and online, and then that will be it.
And then we'll adjourn to some
that corner.
Prosecco in the corner. Yeah, excellent. A bit.
Yes. Yeah. That you can see but not partake in for now. or not partake in at all if you're joining us virtually. So apologies. Anyway, on to business.
Serious business.
On to more serious business, slightly more serious business. So the book generally, just to say a bit about it, in the book Pav is thinking, as the title would suggest, about both the kind of governance of sexuality and racialization and other forms of difference, and how these forms of governance kind of intersect with the primacy of heteronormativity, and the ways in which heteronormativity is key to the constitution of nationalism in Singapore. And I think the book is, I was really taken with it. I think it's a really precise and thoughtful engagement with the notion of heteronormativity, thinking about the kind of norms around heterosexuality govern kind of daily life. And I think you do a really amazing job of kind of materializing how this plays out in the kind of story of nationalism and the development of the kind of nation state in Singapore. We kind of get a really clear sense of how kind of heteronormativity is materialized in the law, in public discourse, and in other kind of forms of kind of state discourse, where we kind of see what the state has to say about itself. And I think you really kind of carefully attend to the fact that there are kind of myriad kind of heteronormativities, and it looks different depending on kind of who's being queered in different moments, who's kind of being made surplus or kind of anterior to the project of the nation state, to the project of nationalism. And I think the book both kind of gives us a really thoughtful and careful kind of genealogy since the kind of formation of the nation state in Singapore in the mid-1960s to the present, but also really clearly theorizes how heteronormativity both operates as an ideology and a practice through forms of repetition in kind of many different sites. And I think you attend really closely to this kind of dialectic between inclusion and exclusion, which maybe we can circle back to. I think one of the things the book does really well is attending to the limits of assimilation, particularly in relation to queer politics, and how people attempt to kind of navigate marginalization, but also the ways in which there's a dual history that you're kind of unpacking, the ways in which the nation state, is kind of governed by and kind of inextricably shaped by its management of difference, how that kind of actually produces the lived realities of nationalism. And then you give us all of these different sites through which to think about how heteronormativity structures life. So we look at public housing, for instance, and who is imagined to be a part of a family. And you also give us a very clear kind of manifestation of the ways in which the state actually cannot kind of imagine queerness. It's not a part of its syntax, you say, in various parts of the book, which I think is really impactful. So I think overall, I think one of the things I really appreciated, is that I think a lot of theorizations of queerness are kind of rooted through the US, and I appreciate obviously that this is not, but also that in the last chapter, when you're kind of mapping a kind of genealogy of Pink Dot, of the mainstream LGBT movement in Singapore, you both kind of resist that kind of mainstream rooting, but also tie it into kind of broader processes of anti-politicization, the ways in which it's not just about the kind of management of queerness, but also about the kind of management of dissent. So I think within this kind of story about heteronormativity, it's also kind of a broader kind of story about the ways in which difference and surplus are managed and kind of mobilized at different key moments in Singaporean history, which strikes me as very important. And I think this broader genealogy is important, and I think it's an important intervention within kind of the space of queer studies. And I also think we have many important interventions in the study of nationalism as well, in that you're saying it's actually really essential that we look quite closely at the work that's being consolidated in the nuclear family and the ways in which the nuclear family is kind of being instantiated and the many different sites in which it is being instantiated. So this question of who is being marked as disposable and who, at the same time, is being marked as central, who is being imagined by the state, and who is kind of left out of this kind of national story, I think is very important. And yeah, I think we can kind of leave it there. I wonder if you want to start by thinking about, we were chatting a little bit earlier about the kind of xenologization, which is your neologism, a word you've invented. I was saying to Pavan, it has the shortest Google search history I've ever seen. It had like 4 entries. And kind of how thinking about this kind of process of rendering foreignness is both intimately related to kind of heteronormativity and its governing work, and how that kind of unfolded in this project for you. I guess to start off.
Well, I guess it's maybe useful to the word xenology and xenologization, which actually I think I should say kind of emerged in conversation with Paul Gilroy, who very offhandedly kind of used that term in conversation, and I thought it was a really useful word. But it's probably useful to take a bit of a detour through nationalism itself, right, as a political force. And I think the book kind of sits in a slightly minoritarian tradition of understanding nationalism, where a lot of nations and nationalism studies, I think, has been dominated by Ben Anderson and friends, as a shorthand, right? So the idea of the imagined community and anyone can sort of be part of the nation. And I guess as a kind of function of my own intellectual formation, but also just, living in Singapore and then in the UK, it seemed to me that that's just didn't quite line up. So I found a more hospitable intellectual home in the theorization that's far more common in what we call cultural studies, I suppose. So Stuart Hall and Gilroy, and then in more recent times, people like Shivamon Valuvan, Nadina Lenani, and so on. And they're sort of very unapologetic about understanding the nation as really this container that just functions on exclusion, continually producing people who do not belong in different contexts, right? And this can be a shifting kind of sense of exclusion. At different moments, different forms of exclusion are brought to the fore. And I've kind of elided a whole host of things, but fundamentally, the theoretical perspective, I guess, of the book sits in consonance with this line of theorization that understands the nation and nationalism as a technology of exclusion and operating in its shadow. So then, to come back to xenology and xenologization, I thought it was useful because it's got two components, right? Xenos, kind of the figure of the foreign, and then the logos bit. And the reason I found it useful theoretically was it's a useful way to index that there are various logics that coalesce within the frame, I guess, of the nation state under the banner of nationalism, through which people can be turned foreign, people can be turned into these figures who do not belong, who can be xenologized. And I found that term useful because it allowed us to do things outside of terms like racialization and gendered and sexualized in a more capacious way, I suppose, right? You can think of these things as happening at the same
children. So, at one point in the book, you write about the fact that there's a distinction, a very kind of on its nose, main text distinction between foreign talent, of whom the population is mainly kind of Euro and white, and foreign workers. And this is kind of brought out in the law. And there's also, a way in which this category, so foreign workers are not allowed to have kind of family. And literally, you say that there are these 6-month medical checks every half a year for women. Of course, and so then we also have the Operation Gender at work institutes. The state's really getting involved in the kind of scrutiny of people's bodies in a really insidious way, but also in a very literal way as well. I think you can really understand the governance of kind of sexuality and foreignness and nationalism is kind of all kind of existing in this moment, where they're literally saying we're going to scrutinize whether or not you're pregnant, and that could lead to a deportation. It's really, to me, it's really boggling. And also a really clear example of kind of what biopolitics can look like when it's not kind of deployed in a kind of deracinated way, but in a very particular way.
I think, well, biopolitics is an excellent way to get into this, right? Because I remember one of your classes actually, when we were talking about biopolitics, and and I remember well, you're explaining it to these students who needed a crash course in what it is, and you made the distinction of moving away from a kind of thinking prior to, or Foucault's big claim being, in medieval times you had make, die, and let live, right? That's kind of setup where you decide who dies, and then everyone else is sort of allowed to live. And the big change in the kind of Foucault's kind of understanding is that rather than that sort of logic at work, you have the make, live, and let die, right? Like that's the kind of the logics that operate as part of biopolitics. And I guess that the bit that I'm interested in is different ways of life making. Right? And different ways that life gets made, and the degrees to which people are permitted to live different kinds of life. And the central argument, I suppose, is that there's a very narrow and prescribed kind of life that is made normal in Singapore, premised upon heterosexual coupling. Among specific groups of people, which then leads to a whole host of exclusions being formed. And one of the things that I do, like you say, like obviously there's exclusion that's produced around queer people, LGBT people, but you also see this in its kind of racialized manifestation around foreign workers, right? And the distinction in state discourse between foreign talent, so this group of people who are also classified as expats, not immigrants, right?
The expat
which we're a lot more familiar with, I think, in these parts. Euro-American, white, invited into the nation to help reproduce it, seen as desirable. And then the other kind of foreign supplement being foreign workers who are invited in on a kind of temporary basis to do the work that no one else really wants to do. And these people tend to come from South Asia and Southeast Asia, poor parts of the regions. They're not allowed to migrate with their families. And in the case of, as you rightly point out, in the case of female foreign workers, they're subject to 6 monthly medical checks to ensure that they're not pregnant. So these medical checks include a pregnancy test. And one of the things that 6 month interval does is it allows them to be deported if they were pregnant prior to third trimester. Right? So there is this sort of very detailed way in which nationalism operates to ensure that these undesirable subjects, non-ideal subjects, are not allowed to reproduce the nation. And I think you start to see the entanglement of sexual logics, particularly heterosexual logics of reproduction, with racialized categories. And they're never really very far apart. We often think that these things belong in different discussions, but often these questions of the birth rate or questions of demographics tend to be entangled really with questions of immigration, who's allowed into the country, under what conditions. And we were kind of chatting about this earlier. This was kind of very mainstream in Singapore. The idea that it's a very small country. The population needs to grow. Fertility, the total fertility rate is important. People need to have kids in service of the nation. It used to be relatively particular, I guess, to Singapore. It's a lot more mainstream now, I think. In the UK and the US, where it's been taken up by the far right. These, non-innocent wings.
They're very concerned.
Yeah, they're very concerned about the birth rate and who is reproducing.
Yeah.
So they're very concerned about abortion as well. And then so very quickly you end up with this, what started off as a question around sexual reproduction becoming racialized, because really if it's a demographic question, in Singapore we're truly concerned about the falling birth rate and not enough people, forming the workforce. The answer is really in immigration. Like, quite easy to solve the problem if expanding immigration policy, but it isn't, right? It's there's a very specific idea about who is allowed to reproduce the nation in Singapore. Singapore has got an immigration policy that the government has stated in Parliament aims to mirror the existing ethnic makeup of the country. And so this is it's one I think it's maybe one of the most outwardly racialized immigration policy. They make no one's attempting to obscure it. It's there, like ministers have said this in Parliament. If we want to maintain the ethnic balance of the country.
We see that in housing. I feel like you've tracked quite carefully how that's these kind of old colonial categories, the kind of CMIO.
Yes, yeah.
Is kind of taken into the kind of present.
Yeah.
And used to kind of insist upon a certain demographic makeup that must be preserved.
Yeah, it's taken as a kind of a priori good, I think. So at the point of independence, Singapore used to be a British colony. At the point of independence in '65, the kind of ethnic makeup of Singapore is roughly 75% Chinese, about 10% Malays, and another 5 to 10% Indian folk. And then you had the rest who were all just categorized as others. Not worth enumerating. But the government since then, the PAP government, has kind of taken that ethnic breakdown as a kind of a God-given truth. Like that has to be maintained, right? So you see this in public housing. There are ethnic quotas that control the number of Chinese, Malay, and Indian people who can occupy any particular apartment block, right? So in any public apartment block, which in Singapore are called HDB block, you can only have 75 to 80% Chinese and 10% Malays and another 10% Indian. And that's then mirrored onto the precincts and neighborhoods. So you have the situation where these apartment blocks and these neighborhoods that people live in are taken to be microcosms of the state or the nation, right? In this kind of racialized manner. How do we get to the racialized breakdown?
We were talking about some kind of anxieties around.
Yes, the immigration policy.
Demography. And how this kind of
so that
unfolds.
absolutely, yeah. So that also informs immigration policy in Singapore. So along the lines of who is allowed to immigrate. Exact data is not given, right? But the government has said before in Parliament that immigration policy is calibrated to ensure that the ethnic balance doesn't change. If you think about it, Singapore's been an independent country for it's coming up to 60 years. This is 60th year as an independent country. The ethnic balance hasn't changed, like zero. It's more or less the same as 65, which is quite incredible when you think about it.
Incredible kind of process of like race.
Yes. And being racialization and the nation being maintained in this kind of freeze frame of time. But then how I got to immigration policy was that we're also starting to see this in other parts of the world, like the US and UK, where the far right has taken an interest in things like birth rate and women giving birth and who is reproducing, encouraging people to have kids. out of a kind of racialized anxiety that our white people are becoming the minority in the country, right? So how we got there, I guess, was really the point that what starts off as this question of sexual reproduction quickly goes into a racialized anxiety, and it ends up in gender because you have the question of women being compelled to give birth, really the question of abortion, women's right over their bodies, and so on.
And the easy conflation of gender and sex in this
very yes.
society as well.
And I think that you can't really talk about one without attending to the other because they all kind of bleed into each other. But very often in these quite coded ways. So when Nigel Farage talked about reproduction, there is also the kind of racial element to it.
He's not just thinking about any.
No. It's a specific group of people he wants to have kids.
Yeah. Project of British whiteness.
Yeah.
Is very much tied in, certain nostalgia. I think there's an interesting relation too between kind of nostalgia and futurity and how that kind of impacts nationalism as well that I think we can get into. At one moment in the book you say nationalism is kind of always operating in the present.
Yeah.
Kind of is oriented toward the present. So you have a kind of imagining the past. You kind of have this national story, but you also have a framing of a kind of presentist understanding of the nation, and also a kind of future-oriented understanding of the work that the family must do. So I feel like in thinking about kind of heteronormativity and how it's reproduced materially, you do like a really thorough job of thinking through the kind of careful consolidation of the nuclear family, the kind of ways in which it's instantiated through the law, and how people are kind of, and housing, the ways in which these flats are not built to accommodate kind of multi-generational families or extended families. They're built for a kind of nuclear family, and the ways in which that's thought of ideologically, and the ways in which there's a material constraint there, because if you want to buy a flat, you literally can't bring an extended family along.
Yeah, you have to be married. I mean, maybe that's worth laying out a little.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So the background, I suppose, is that in Singapore, about 90% of the country lives in public housing. These are tall tower blocks, built to a high standard. They're comfortable. These days smaller than they used to be in the 90s, but comfortable, safe. And 90% of the population of Singaporeans live in these flats, these apartments. But to purchase one of these HDB flats, you need to be married, and you don't have same-sex marriage in Singapore, so you have to be a heterosexual couple. If not married, at least declaring an intention to marry. And I think once you declare the intention, you have to get married within 6 months, or you lose the flat. There are some kind of laws around that. You need to get married within a particular period of time, let's say, if you want to hang on to the flat. And so I think that's one way in which there's a particularly powerful sexual norm that's tied into the housing. But the exact wording of the policy is really the intention to form a nuclear family. So family formation really is the kind of rationalizing logic around housing, which means that you have this kind of situation where the nation is envisioned in this sort of strange tessellation of nuclear families in these neat HDB flats, right? Of course, there is the question of people who live in private housing, which I think allows us to open the interesting register of class and how one can sort of escape these pressures through a certain class position. But by and large, for most people, there is this kind of production of a heterosexual norm that is then realized through housing and domesticity. And then you have family formation that is centralized as a rationalizing logic around who is entitled to domesticity privacy, I suppose, right? And the heterosexual nuclear family is placed at the center of that. So when one gets married and that's treated as the point of formation of a new nuclear family, that is also the point where you're treated as deserving to move out of your family home and build your own home. However, not too far.
Yes.
Because ideally, again, this is kind of reinforced through a raft of policy, like, for example, the proximity housing fund, which gives couples a little bit of extra money if they were to live within, I think, 1 kilometer or 2 kilometers of their parent home. And the reason is kind of mutual care. So in the parents' younger years, relatively younger years, they will be able to look after their grandkids. And then subsequently, the children would be able, the adult children would be able to look after their aging parents. And it's a really interesting way in which I think family formation and sexual logics also get bound up in these logics of care, right? Who's looking after whom at what point in their lives. It's very literally put into practice via these various policies that exist. But it also allows the state to just vacate that space of social care. And so you have these various iterations of weirdly conservative logics, the different forms of conservatism, bound up with more kind of 90s neoliberal logic that the state doesn't really have a role to play in the provision of public goods. All of which is happening through things like heterosexual family formation, right? And the HDB flat. Did I answer the question? I kind of went off on that.
No, I mean, I think this is what we're unpacking, what's in the book and what are the stakes. And I mean, I think you do a really clear job also. I mean, I think through this argument, through understanding there are kind of myriad sites where heteronormativity is being reproduced, we get a clear sense of the kind of relation between materiality and ideology, the ways in which you kind of have this kind of perfect machinery for the kind of smooth operation of certain norms that become constitutive and yet absent. I mean, so both the state becomes absent, but also, norms around the nuclear family presumably in some ways become easy to see, but in other ways are actually quite difficult to see because they become common sense. I think we start out with a kind of, Paulian or kind of Gramscian notion of common sense. And I think we get a really clear understanding of the ways in which heteronormativity is hegemonic, and also hegemonic in the ways in which it determines its opposition as well. So it both kind of dominates the space of inquiry and the space of response or opposition, which you map out through Pink Dot. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about the kind of politics of assimilation and.
Well, I think before we get there, I think the thing that led me to it was trying to figure. I never wanted to work with queer theory in the first place.
I guess how did you get to queer theory?
I never really wanted to work with it because my training is not in it. But in many ways, maybe that led to kind of eclectic engagement with it. Because I found myself quite frustrated with some of the stuff that was really identitarian, right? And kind of in bits, kind of romanticization of deviance. Like, if you're having a threesome, it's somehow politically progressive. It seems strange to me. But then you discover that I discovered there's a kind of branch of queer studies that pushes against it, really in its originary manifestation.
It is nascent with color. It's emerging with formation.
And ways of thinking beyond who one is having sex with, in a more politically conscious kind of manner. And that kind of helped because it helped me to then think about the way in which, one of the big claims I think I was trying to make in the book is, I think sometimes in nationalism studies, race as a category can be overdetermined. Right? And so I wanted to think about ways in which a particular sexual norm could be elevated. And I think in Singapore you see that really clearly, and I suspect that was why I was getting a little frustrated with the stuff that I was reading, both around Singapore and how to understand nation building in Singapore, but also the kind of Anglo-American queer theory that it just didn't seem to match with what was going on. I found the kind of that branch of queer theory that thought beyond identity really useful to think about how a particular sexual norm can be elevated at the expense of others. To make life, to kind of echo the biopolitics logic, to make different kinds of lives livable at different forms. And then when you couple that with nationalism, those who cannot express their sexuality or live life in ways that do not conform to that elevated form of sexual expression, these people can become at different moments outsiders, right? Xenologists. So that's the bit on heteronormativity. Now, Pink Dot is, I guess, the bit that I try to grapple with as much as I responsibly can in the book, because Pink Dot is the biggest LGBT movement in Singapore. Like it operates on a different scale. Pink Dot at its recent iterations attracts up to kind of 20,000 people to its rally, which is unheard of in terms of activism in Singapore. That I kind of give for reasons of scale. I try to look at other activist rallies, and there's only really the climate movement that I think was when I was writing the book was attracting kind of 3,000 to 4,000 or so. Right? So it's operating on a different scale. Singapore has got its own kind of history with protest and protest being circumscribed in quite particular and tight ways, where protest is basically legal except for one particular part of the country, an area called Hong Lim Park. So Pink Dot has done really well to build itself as a voice for the LGBT community, and I think it's grown from when it started in 2008 to what it's doing now, quite spectacularly, and it's essentially an assimilationist movement. It kind of operates on logics of queer people have got families too. We are not the figures of we're not threatening figures as we're often made out to be. We are Singaporeans as well, so that the Singaporean motif is a big thing in Pink Dot's rhetoric, and it's got lots of every year around Pink Dot, which really is a single day kind of event that is held in Hong Lim Park, the one place that protest is allowed and public gatherings are allowed. It holds what is essentially a kind of a really fun picnic. That is how it's conceptualized. It encourages people bring a picnic night along. Hang out with your friends and other queer folk, and show your support by showing up. And I think that there is something to the kind of the show of strength and numbers, gathering in one place and demonstrating that one, there are lots of queer people, and also they are not alone. That's really important. But a lot of the rhetoric of Pink Dot is that we fit into the nation, we are productive workers, we matter, we are Singaporean citizens, we deserve these basic rights, and we can fit into the nation in a host of ways. And I think I was struck by two things. The first being it's a kind of desire to be included in the nation, right? Which I think is very understandable. I don't begrudge people who've been forsaken by the nation state wanting to be part of it, because it can seem quite inviting, right? But I was struck by that. You're trying to consort with this thing that has produced your exclusion, right? It has actively cast you as a figure that does not belong and is threatening in a host of ways, and yet you want to be part of it. So that's the first thing that kind of struck me. The second is the very, very narrow way in which Pink Dot tries to build its movement, which is really around sexual minorities. And I thought that there are ways in which other people who are minoritized, like the same logics, are not entirely included, right? It seemed to me like there are opportunities to build solidarity that haven't been taken out, which can make sense in within the logics of that movement. I can see why organizers might decide that you're going to focus on sexual propriety and how LGBT citizens are deserving of the human rights that other citizens enjoy. But I also did think that there are ways in which, housing, for example, the requirement that one has to be married obviously affects gay people. It also affects people who choose not to get married, or people who aren't married, or divorced parents. And there are ways that I think you can build solidarities amongst these different groups of people in a more politically progressive manner. So that's my thing with Pink Dot. I try to think through it. I think a lot of the activism that has been carried out has been carried out under really difficult circumstances, and I think it's done a lot of good for LGBT folk in Singapore. I think it's a really important movement, operates on a huge scale. But also I do wonder if it has reached its limits, in terms of what can be done with that kind of identitarian vision.
And mapping the limits is really important. I think that's some of what we get here is a clear kind of mapping of what the politics of kind of respectability or kind of assimilationist kind of politics can make possible and what it forecloses.
Yeah.
You were saying, there are possible alliances with people who are minoritized beyond kind of being a sexual minority, but the premise that you were kind of laying out is that there's a real focus on this kind of citizen, non-citizen binary that I think often emerges in, I think, many different kind of national LGBT kind of projects in different geographies.
Yeah.
We're just like you, our family is just like you, love is love.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's also worth pointing out that a lot of these forms of duress that Pink Dot appears to operate with, so that the kind of citizen non-citizen binary is also produced by the state, and it's kind of laws around protest, which only allow citizens to take part in protest. And a state that is very, very nervous about foreign interference. And I think it is responding to those forms of duress that are placed upon it, right? And I think it's worth acknowledging. I can see how that produces a kind of movement that is also entirely responding to citizens, foregrounding citizens in this way that can seem nationalistic, but it's really a response to the forms of duress it is under. But I also think, we kind of briefly chatted about this earlier, right? I think the biggest gain that the LGBT community has made in the last 15 years or so is the repeal of Section 377A, right, which is the anti-sodomy law that Singapore inherited from the British. And that happened in 2023, I think. January of 2023 is when it was kind of signed, it was repealed officially. But Pink Dot had been going on about the repealing the law, trying to pressure the government into repealing the law for a long time, for 7-8 years, I think. It started in about 2017 or so. And every year, the annual rallies that they would organize, this was a recurring theme, ready for repeal. At one rally, the Pink Dot spokesperson memorably said, Prime Minister, tear down this law, right? And it kind of echo of the 89 Berlin Wall, injunction, right? Tear down this law. So you have these things, but the government never really moved. And all of the kind of rationalizing logics around the pressure to repeal 377A was, look, it's producing a lot of inequalities around the lives of LGBT people. gay men can't live their lives freely. There is this kind of the worry that the law might be used to persecute them. Because since 2007, the government had kind of assured everyone that the law would not actually be enforced on adults in private, non-consensual situations. But it was there, right? But so Pink Dot, that was the kind of object of Pink Dot's activism for many years. It was the object of LGBT activism for many years. It seems to me like nothing really was moving for that kind of 7-8 years until a constitutional challenge in court in 2022, I think, or 2021, resulted in the Supreme Court declaring that 3778 was entirely unenforceable in its entirety, right? So the court basically declared it a bad law. And the Attorney General provided an opinion to the government that it could be struck down, firstly, by the courts. And if it were to be struck down, then marital laws could be challenged, right? So then the heterosexual definition of marriage, upon which so much of Singaporean life relies on, right? Housing, family formation, that could all go to pieces, because that could be challenged. And the government moved incredibly quickly. Like, that opinion was formed in 2022. By the end of the year, the government had formed legislation to, repeal 3778, whilst also including a clause that prevented the courts from challenging the heterosexual definition of marriage.
So it's preservation. Exactly.
That was, yeah.
This kind of inclusion, operation
yeah.
was at work.
So yeah, absolutely. So as much as there was a kind of removal of that homophobic law, there was also within that same piece of legislation the kind of strengthening of heterosexual logics around marriage. But it just seems to me that it was only when the kind of those heteronormative logics upon which so much of Singapore's nation building rests on, it's only when that was threatened that the state moved, and it moved incredibly quickly, very, very fast. Which just seems to me like proof of the fact that all of this stuff about, you can form solidarities with different groups of people, I don't think it's just theoretical innovation. I think that there is a very practical outcome. You can derive some solid benefits, even if you're just thinking in these narrow terms. I think it seems to me like a very practical thing to at least think about, if not undertake. Bracketing for a moment, the difficult conditions in which protest occurs, but it seems to me like something potentially very productive.
Absolutely, yeah. This kind of gray space that we were talking about, because I think you say at various points, queerness literally can't be imagined within the kind of grammars or syntax of the state, and the laws as they exist. The family is literally prescribed as, kind of consisting of a man and a woman, and that's the kind of relation that's been codified. So we have the kind of codification of kinship and kind of reification through repetition, which you kind of take us through Butler to kind of get there. So we can see how it's kind of becomes hegemonic, but it's also, this is a really interesting moment where we can see how potentially subversive this kind of gray space, this unreadability that's kind of is suggested by that which the state cannot see or is unable to read. Not to fetishize it, because it's like, as you say, people are working in difficult conditions. And these are the conditions in which the politics of assimilation emerge out of the need for survival. But I think also like these systems are very flexible, and that's why we have, as you kind of referenced, theorizations of kind of homo-nationalism and homo-capitalism, which are kind of mapping these processes of capture, the processes by which kind of some subjects are kind of brought into the fold to further intensify other exclusions. So there's always, I think, you write at one point like nationalism, exclusion is all it has. And I thought that was just like was perfect. It is what this is what it's premised on. It's this kind of constant kind of assemblage of producing surplus, producing its others. Because you can't have this kind of empty center it's kind of Psychian, we need to have the kind of exterior to have a kind of potent center. I think we see this really clearly. And see this, I think it's a really clear mapping of heteronormativity, which is maybe a bit more difficult to kind of grasp in contexts where it's been more aggressively normalized. So thinking of the context we live and work in, in the UK. I think sometimes it can be difficult to see kind of how deeply kind of a certain understanding of the family operates, kind of condition society, and also homonormativity as well. We have to talk about that too.
I mean, the syntax thing is an interesting one, right? I think that's the thing that's quite striking about the whole. You kind of rewind to the way that housing is premised on heterosexual marriage. So in Singapore, under the Women's Charter, marriage is defined as the union of one man and one woman. That's kind of prescribed in the law. There isn't anything that kind of excludes queer people. It doesn't say that same-sex marriages are not recognized, right? Which means that you have this situation where the state cannot kind of process those relations. It cannot. You just kind of it sees queer people as singles. You're unmarried. Right? You don't have the grammar to read queer people as queer. So as part of this raft of laws around housing, you need to be married to purchase a HDB flat. However, singles over 35 can also purchase a flat, right? So if you're single after 35,
I love this arbitrary age. They're like when you're really
you've reached, you've reached 35, you're clearly not going to get married. So singles can purchase a flat when they turn 35, and that's one of the ways in which queer couples have tried to get around them. Right? You kind of you purchase a flat as two singles, and it just struck me that there's no way for the state to recognize a queer couple as a queer couple. You can only read them as two single people, right?
Roommates.
Yes, friends.
Very good
friends. One bed.
They can afford two.
Such is the reality.
Very close.
So I was quite interested in that, and when we were talking about the syntax stuff earlier, I just thought like it seemed this bit of unintelligible queer life seems a little bit like video games where you have the background that isn't properly programmed. This actually is Zizek kind of he uses this analogy where you have the bits of the video game that you're not meant to go there.
I like it's just we're thinking of it as our own game we practice and theorizing it.
Yeah, I think like, in many ways queer life in Singapore can be like that. Queerness and identity sense. There are bits that they're not properly programmed into the law, so the state can't really understand what you're doing in that grey unprogrammed space. Like what kind of coupling is going on? Not very sure. Must be single. And I think it allows for potential forms of creative resistance, and people in Singapore have written about that. Michel Lazar's work, very good on laying out the way that people get around them. But I think what I found quite striking is that there are people who are forced to beat a path around the law in the first place. Right? Why do you need to put on this dance? And I guess that's where the book kind of sits. It is trying to think about that sort of those grey spaces and what happens in those weird spaces.
Yeah, I think there's a way in which the law in this account is so hegemonic, and I think we were talking about this, the kind of relationship between absence and presence.
Yeah.
The state's done a lot of work and in this kind of hyper-present way, and then is able to kind of step away and kind of let this machinery work.
Yeah.
Heteronormative machinery kind of unfold, and also to kind of abscond from any responsibility. Some of these policies where they're like, oh, well, if your relatives are over 60, you have to take care of them, for instance.
Yeah.
I was really struck by that.
Yeah. I think you see those logics permeate into social work, for example, right? So there's some work in Singapore on how social work is, if you need financial assistance, the first step that social workers do is kind of map out your family and try to work out if you can get money from your family first. So once kinship ties have been exhausted of these assistants, then the state steps in. And I mean, Singapore's first prime minister was kind of unabashed about it. Lee Kuan Yew, when in his early years, I think the quote was something like, first I'll see if your family can help you, and then I will help you. He kind of used himself as a metronym for the state. Right? So first, your family has to try and help you, and then the state will step in, which was a kind of counterpoint to the welfare system that was operating in the UK, kind of the beverage plan. So Singapore kind of positioned itself as the counterpoint then, and that has just continued since, where the family is this kind of bulwark against the provision of welfare. And you're right, it allows the state to just disappear and not provide these things, which should be a public good. Right?
Yeah. I mean, I think we can really clearly see the role of the family in this account.
Yeah. And
also in quite a kind of like John Demillion way as well. I don't know this thing, but it should be, right? And you cite this throughout, the ways in which like capitalism kind of creates the conditions for the emergence of gay identity through the kind of restructuring of the economy and family and nascent city life. I mean, D'Amelio's working out of the US.
His work's really strong on that as well,
Yeah.
isn't it? Like to identify the way that kind of gay identity was produced out of a particular form of capitalism.
Exactly.
It's created a new set of problems as opposed to try and resolve.
It does, yeah. I mean, the law, and I think we can extend that further to think about, how the law does create a whole host of problems that it purports to then be able to solve. And it's like, I think there's a real kind of desire to see it potentially as a site of redress, but I think it's a kind of reform. It's like we can go back to Rosa Luxemburg. It's kind of a reform or revolution question where it's like, is this, what logics are being reproduced when we kind of work within the law, and what are the kind of unspoken assumptions of the law as well? I think you really attend to that. Beautifully. Should we do some questions?
I think so,
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's.
Grand. If folks, when they go, just want to also introduce themselves, so you sense that who's here, and also if people online have any questions, that would be great. So, yeah, Jean.
Hi, Jean Smith, also in the Department of Interdisciplinary Humanities. A couple of kind of just detailed questions. I was wondering if the pronatalist policies are kind of aimed at the different groups in Singapore in the same way, or if they kind of vary as they're, in terms of how they're aimed. And then also, you kind of partly began to answer this as you were speaking about this law about having to be married. I mean, what do people who aren't married for whatever reason, that you outlaw? What do they do? Basically, I suppose.
Live at home.
Just live with, and if they don't have parents to live with, I guess.
Yeah,
they're
They're
just out of luck.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I was also wondering, how are these kind of social care policies enforced? How do you sort of force someone to take care of their so these are the kind of practical questions. And then I think we must have spoken about this before, but I was really struck by the way in which this idea of kind of mirroring existing ethnic makeup, how similar that is to a lot of the policies I've studied in apartheid South Africa, especially in the immediate post-war period where there's this idea of kind of wanting to maintain the same balance within whiteness of Afrikaners, English, even religious balance. So like same amount of Jewish people, Catholics, Protestants, in terms of these are all goals that are never usually articulated in there, or never usually they never usually are able to do this, but they're trying to do this. Like, okay, so if we can get a certain amount of we can only take a certain amount of Italians because they're Catholic, or we can only take a certain amount of Jewish refugees, so it just really struck me how much of what you're talking about is familiar to me from my research on apartheid South Africa.
But it's quite striking because South Africa, I wasn't familiar with the context, but then every time you talk about it, I'm just struck by how similar the governance of the
at least the attempt at doing that, I suppose.
Yeah, the attempt at governing the kind of demography of the country is. The first thing was what is single? Yeah. Well, the one that's easiest to deal with is people who are single or not married, right? It's just you're just stuck in this really messy situation. If you're lucky, you can at least live at home if that's a safe, comfortable situation. But otherwise, I guess you either have to look to rent on the private housing market, which is quite expensive. Singapore doesn't have a massive private rental housing market, partly because so many people live in public housing, which is readily available to a degree. Like it takes the kind of the backlog of construction is starting to catch up, but you can access it. But so rental is expensive. So again, there's a way in which class kind of provides you with the allows you to ameliorate these conditions. But otherwise, you are kind of compelled to live in what might be a quite unsafe situation. This is something like the pink dot highlights, right? That often queer people, if you don't come from a family that is supportive, can be compelled to live in a domestic situation that is just quite unsafe or just quite stressful. So yeah, it just leaves you in a quite messy situation because the nuclear family can be quite suffocating that way. And then the pronatalist stuff. Yeah, I don't think I get into this very much in the book as much as I maybe should have. But amidst the general hymn of the urge to reproduce, right, for people to have kids, there are some sociologists who've kind of noted that there's a slightly different tune being sung, in particular the Malay community. The idea that they have too many kids.
Right.
There used to be these quite racist comments that would swirl in the country that in the mosque they tell them to have more children, even though they can't support quite horrible racist sentiments that would be circulating in anecdotal conversation. But yeah, there is quite a bit of work around the state's different kind of messaging. Yoyan Teo is one sociologist who's really good for it. And I don't really get into that very much, but that is obviously a kind of site where you see the differences or you see the racialized differences in how natalism is being applied, right? And then the question of social care, there is some law to that effect. The Maintenance of Family Act, I think it's called, which mandates that adult children have to pay a certain amount to their parents. I don't know the number of people who've actually taken their kids to court for this. I don't think it's very high.
It's very low.
It is very low, yeah.
So sort of similar to the way that parents might be required to maintain their children.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So I think, we kind of tangentially talked about it. I think there's a pedagogical effect that the law has, a kind of psychic effect as well. That it's there. It's not often invoked, but it is there to kind of signal that this is expected of adult children to look after your parents. And then I think a lot of heavy lifting is still done by this Asian values discussion. That term, the Asian values term, has kind of fallen out now. I don't think people. It's not really invoked in that particular manner. But the sense that we're an Asian society and there's the notion of filial piety, you look after your family, that's there. It's strong in the background. I think it does a lot of ideological and economic work in one, mandating that adult children look after their parents, which is probably a good thing. But I think that the other thing that it allows to do is it allows the state to just absent itself, and that creates a form of duress. So I think the enforcement comes really in this sort of more rhetorical, ideological sense. Was it?
No, that's it. Sorry,
okay.
That's it. Thank you so much. Looking forward to talking more about later.
I think you do a good job in the book of also tracking how Asian values kind of becomes a discourse and then it's kind of thoroughly sublimated but still is kind of animating.
Yeah, I think it's become kind of old-fashioned now, I think, to use that particular term. But the logic's still circular. Often you hear in Singapore people say stuff like, oh, in the West they just dump their parents on the sidewalk. It's like completely, hyperbolic stuff like that. They don't care about the parents. Which is just not true. But also I think it's kind of reflective of the sense in which the family is expected to step into this space that the state has vacated, but that bit isn't really
perfect for it.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Audrey. I'm from Birkbeck, University of London. I actually have two questions and curiosity regarding the book. So the first one is when you mentioned about the scene that the pink dot and then they're having a picnic, and then the concept of assimilation, and then where you're explaining you're trying to grapple this phenomenon. But I'm curious if you in the book if you touch for example the concept of negotiation, the Homi Baba negotiation, and negotiate two cultures, and then provided that power is evenly distributed between the two, so it's neither one or the other but something else. That's how Baba explained negotiation. So maybe it's not an assimilation, maybe it's a negotiation somewhere in the process. If nationalism is a process of identity formation, maybe somewhere in the process there was a even distribution of power, so they were able to negotiate. So it could be it's no longer the same as the British gave it, but it's something else. So I'm curious about that. I am thinking about negotiation because if you mentioned about I was from the Philippines, so I've never been to Singapore, but I know that in Singapore there are ethnicities and race. So the concept of Singapore itself as a nation, or an imagined community, if we're going to use from top to bottom approach of nationalist identity formation, it's probably a negotiated, I may be wrong, a negotiated imagined community, because there's the Indian, there's the Chinese, and then there's the Malay. So they negotiated, and then the output is the concept of Singapore. So I think negotiation plays, I may be wrong. So that's my concept. If you explored it somewhere in the book, exposed to it. The second is about because I'm curious about because it probably is an ethno-symbolic exploration of nationalist identity formation. If you ever touched how body without citizenship, meaning the imagined community, Singaporean citizenship, is being somewhere in the process is being reduced into a cultural marker necessary for the construction of a nation. Because we talk about heteronormativity, which is more ideological, but before that or with that there is a body of a Chinese, of a Malay, of an Indian, for example, of South Asian. I'm sorry. So did you explore it, how a body before citizenship is being reduced into a cultural marker, so that they may be necessary in the construction of a nation? So I'm curious about that. Because it.
Really interesting. But the first one on Homi Baba, I mean, this is probably more of a me problem. I can't really get Homi Baba. I think he's obviously a very smart guy. And the stuff about hybridization is, potentially useful. I don't know, but I just can't get it. I read it, I kind of understand what's going on, I think. But I also feel like I've missed a few things. I don't quite understand, I think, which is why I don't really deal with it very much. Probably, it's me. So this is just my limitation. I think that there are some things I just can't seem to penetrate. I think, Baba's stuff is probably one of those. But the thing about negotiating identity, I think is it is relevant. I just think I haven't been able to bring that theoretical apparatus into the book. And then the question of the body and the racialized body, I think, is really interesting. Well, what happens before you superimpose the conceptual frame of the nation state upon them, right? And I think the colonial British state did a lot of work there. Syed Hussein Alatas is excellent, I think, for this, thinking about how in British Malaya the myth of the lazy Malay was invented, indolent natives was invented, right? To render the Malay body legible, I think, in some ways, within the colonial imagination. And then there were also ways in which the Indian community was racialized with its own kind of stereotypes, with alcohol and unruliness coming into play. And kind of the Chinese community, the good worker, the coolies who will work hard for you and are very, very productive, that sort of thing. All of which I think have their own kind of afterlives. Not necessarily always neatly, but I think they do have afterlives that kind of show up. Does that answer the question? I'm thinking as I'm speaking.
I'm really curious because I'm coming from the idea like the imagined community of Singapore itself is already a negotiated space between the Malay, the Chinese, and the South Asians. But before that, like how does the state you utilize the body before the citizenship or the imagined community Singapore to make it a cultural marker to be useful in nation building. So I'm curious. I don't know. Maybe it's.
Prior to that, I don't think there was very much nation building that was going on. Right? We had basically the British colonial state that was there till the mid-60s, 63 really. I don't think there was very much to say by way of nation building. I don't think the British were very interested in nation building, but there were kind of ways in which the body was put towards racialized body was put towards particular ends. It's a really interesting question.
Yeah, it is. I think it's also, different people kind of pick up different kind of theoretical apparatuses. If you can, in the first chapter, you really kind of sit with, what did we say, Anderson and Friends?
Yeah.
With this kind of, this kind of, because I think that's part of the intervention, is you kind of have this kind of mainstream kind of narration of the nation and nationalism. This is also not my field, so I also don't want to stray too far. But I read Anderson through in anthropology seminars when I was studying.
But you see, the thing with Anderson is, I suspect that people don't read the book all the way to the end.
No.
Because he kind of reads to page 5 when he talks about imagined community, and he said, all right, close the book, and I've got the stuff that I need. Because actually, Anderson he's got a really sharp bit in near the end of the book where he talks about the nation becoming at its strongest when it has an enemy. I can't remember the exact formulation that Anderson has, but he's drawing on Gopal Balakrishnan. or Balakrishna identifies as fit, right? Near the end of, but he really talks about the nation being formed in the relief of its otherness, which I think it's often missed. And it leads to Anderson being, used as shorthand for this imagined community, which seems to be put to all kinds of use these days in the kind of theorization of nationalism. But I think that Anderson does have that. I think he doesn't explore it as much as he could have. But that's also possibly a function of when you're writing the 80s and stuff.
He's a modernist. He belongs to the modernist school. So we start from institutions down. Like if we go for somewhere like the ethno-symbolic, from the symbols that we deploy and we consume up in nationalism. So I think that's a limit. That's the limitation of Anderson in a way, because but that's how he theorizes. More about institutions, modernist from top to bottom.
The bit that I kind of find, or the limit that I reach with the liberal theories or the liberal modernist theories of the nation is fundamentally, I think they read the nation as this container of belonging. People just haven't reached. If you don't belong, it's because you just haven't you haven't spoken the language or something.
They haven't leveled up.
Exactly, yeah. You haven't done something, but you can do it. Learn the language. Do the right thing, hold the correct cultural marker, and you're in. I just don't think that's how it operates. And I think like people like Paul Gilroy was really sharp on it, right? And I think it's really instructive that Paul's writing in the 80s as well, right? At the same time that Anderson's got the Imagined Communities coming out, Paul's got Ain't No Black in the Union Jack. And that's a really sharp book that identifies, the way that race, what's the conception that Paul uses? Race relies on its kind of the blurriness between race and nation to operate. And I think somehow Anderson has, I think, overdetermined the theorization of nationalism in many ways. It's a fantastic book. But I think also like that front bit kind of overdetermines the theorization of nationalism. I find that quite difficult to theorize with. I think that is the limit of liberal modernist theories of the nation. They read the nation as this quite benign instrument, right? That one just hasn't found myself included in. And I think that's not how I approach it. I'm interested in the exclusions that it generates.
Thanks for your question. That's great. And I feel like this will continue post.
I imagine, yeah.
Sure.
Hi, Jared Zimbler, also at King's. I've been wondering how Singapore's heteronormativity might inflect the state's projection of itself into the international space, if it does at all. And that's the question.
Yeah. That's a really generative question. I think there's, in many ways, in a kind of glib way, I think there's outward-facing Singapore and inward-facing. And outward-facing Singapore is this cosmopolitan, modern, welcoming country where anyone can make a home, right? And I think Singapore is rightly, I suppose, proud of the fact that it's an extremely safe place. So despite all of this intense heteronormative, intense glare of heteronormativity, I suppose, it's also an extremely safe place where it's overwhelmingly unlikely to get beaten up for being there. The kind of live and let live attitude is the predominant one. And so I think it's quite happy, the state is quite happy to take the position that, everyone is safe and welcome as a kind of minimal guarantee, which when you think about it is it's a really low bar, right? But also a bar that isn't crossed in many places. And it's quite happy to offer that up. Everyone is welcome here, regardless of who you are and your sexual orientation. You are
you are safe and you will be welcome. And ministers do this all the time. They're quite happy to in public forums talk about sexual minorities being welcome. Talk about attracting foreign talent regardless of their sexual orientation, and being a kind of hospitable space. And then in the same breath, I think the state will also say, part of this discourse, that the important thing is that sexual minorities should not try and change mainstream society. And again, it will be very unabashed about this, and this was particularly around the discussions to do with repealing the anti-sodomy law. The government would be quite unabashed about saying in Parliament, look, gay people should not be persecuted, they should not be beaten up, they should be able to live a safe life. At the same time, they must not impose their norms on mainstream society, where society is seen as, or rather, heterosexuality is seen as the building block on which Singapore society is built. And building block is a kind of verbatim phrase that a lot of political leaders use. So I think it's quite instructive. That's how they see society as being put together. And then, anyone else who doesn't fit in is kind of the frills, I suppose. I think that is how it generally projects itself.